Emily Parker was kneeling on the floor of Sophie's room, gently arranging the stuffed animals on the bed. "There, now all your friends are ready to welcome you back from school," Emily said with a warm smile, as Sophie, in her perfectly pressed uniform, watched with bright eyes. The 11-year-old child couldn't contain the affection she felt for Emily. Since her mother's death 2 years ago, it was the nanny who filled the void left by her mother's absence, offering unconditional love she didn't even know she needed. "Emily, do you think my mom would like how I am today?" Sophie asked, nervously fidgeting with the hem of her skirt. The question made Emily's heart ache. She knew how much the girl still missed her mother, and every detail of daily life seemed to revolve around that absence. "I'm absolutely certain your mother would be so proud of you," Emily replied, crouching down to be at Sophie's level. "You're growing into an amazing girl, just like she always dreamed." Emily's words were filled with tenderness, but also a responsibility that went beyond her job as a nanny. She felt it was her mission to ensure Sophie never felt alone. The routine at the Wilson household was marked by a delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. The father, James Wilson, was a busy businessman who rarely had time for family moments. Over the past 2 years, Emily had taken on the role of mother, educator, and confidant to Sophie, organizing her schedules and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in the girl's life. Breakfast, for example, was a ritual Emily made sure to keep. Every morning she would prepare heart-shaped pancakes, something Sophie adored, while they discussed their plans for the day. However, the dynamics had changed since Victoria Reed, James's new wife, entered their lives. Victoria, an impeccably dressed woman with an imposing presence, had arrived like a whirlwind, bringing with her an air of sophistication, but also an emotional detachment that Sophie could sense, even if she couldn't articulate it in words. Initially, Emily had made efforts to maintain a cordial relationship with Victoria, but gradually she realized something seemed amiss. Victoria rarely interacted directly with Sophie, limiting herself to occasional comments about her appearance or school performance, but never genuinely engaging. It was Emily who was there to soothe Sophie's nightmares, help with homework, or listen to her endless stories about the books she read. Victoria, on the other hand, seemed more preoccupied with organizing elegant dinners and social events than building a bond with her stepdaughter. "Emily, can you help me with my hair? I want to do that braid you're so good at," Sophie asked with a hopeful smile. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed a comb and began working on the girl's soft brown hair. While they chatted about a science project Sophie was excited to present at school. These were the moments Emily cherished above all else, a simple yet profound connection that made her feel like part of that family, even though she knew her position was fragile. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Victoria was organizing flower delivery for an event she would have that evening. Her firm voice filled the room as she gave instructions over the phone. "I want white floral arrangements, no bold colors. Everything must be perfect," she said, completely ignoring Sophie and Emily passing through the room on their way to school. The contrast between Emily's warm attention and Victoria's coldness was evident, but no one dared comment on it, especially with James always so absent. On the way to school, Emily made sure to reinforce how special Sophie was. "Did you know that no matter what happens, you are so loved?" Emily asked, looking at the girl through the rearview mirror. Sophie nodded, but her eyes showed there was still an internal struggle to fully accept that. "I know you miss your mum, Sophie, and that's natural, but you have so many people who care about you, and I'm one of them," Emily added, her voice full of sincerity. When they arrived at school, Sophie gave Emily a tight hug before running off to meet her friends. Emily stood still for a few seconds, watching the girl walk away. There was something about Sophie that made her want to fight the whole world if necessary to protect her. Back at the house, Emily continued with her daily tasks, organizing Sophie's room, doing laundry, and preparing dinner, while Victoria remained in her office, talking on the phone with some important contact. It was always like this. Two women under the same roof but in entirely different worlds. Emily couldn't help but notice how detached Victoria seemed, even from James, who came home late at night and left early in the morning. There was an emptiness in that house that not even Emily's loving gestures could fully fill. When Sophie returned from school later that day, she was excited to share the success of her science project. "Emily, you won't believe it. "My teacher said it was the best project in the class," she exclaimed, entering the kitchen with a radiant smile. Emily put down her apron and opened her arms to receive the girl in a warm embrace. "I knew you could do it. You worked so hard and deserve all the recognition," Emily replied, proud. The scene was sweet, but there was an observant gaze at the door. Victoria was standing there, arms crossed, watching the interaction between Emily and Sophie, with an expression that was hard to decipher. She said nothing, but the environment was charged by her presence. Emily noticed, but chose to ignore it, focusing on Sophie's joy. The seemingly normal routine concealed subtle yet significant changes that Emily felt deep in her heart. Victoria's arrival had brought a silent, almost imperceptible tension that hung in the air like a shadow. Sophie, despite her energy and joy, seemed to desperately seek the stability Emily offered. And Emily, even though she was just the nanny, felt it was her responsibility to keep the girl protected, even if it meant facing challenges she couldn't yet foresee. The morning started like any other at the Wilson mansion. Emily was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, with heart-shaped pancakes and a carefully arranged bouquet of cut fruits for Sophie. The girl was already seated at the table, excited, while she talked about the plans for the day. James was absent as usual, leaving Emily in the role of the main maternal figure in the household's daily routine. Victoria entered the room, impeccably dressed as always, with a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Emily, when you're done here, I want you to organize my office. It's a mess and I need everything impeccable before an important meeting," said Victoria, in a tone that was more of an order than a request. Emily nodded, as always, hiding any discomfort. Despite Victoria's cold behavior, Emily was determined to keep the peace because of Sophie. After breakfast, Emily went upstairs to Victoria's office, as requested. The room was a reflection of its owner, organized but without any human warmth. Emily began cleaning the surfaces and reorganizing the papers, while a slight worry arose in her mind. Victoria rarely left her alone in her private space. Still, Emily continued her work, carefully moving a pile of envelopes when something in the corner of the room caught her attention. It was the safe. Normally hidden by a decorative cabinet, it was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to close it completely. Emily paused for a moment, pondering whether she should notify Victoria, but decided it would be best to simply close the safe and continue with her tasks. When she approached it, however, she noticed something strange. The safe was empty. There was no sign of the important documents or valuables that James usually kept there. Her heart began to beat faster. It wasn't her responsibility to touch it, but the situation seemed serious. Carefully, Emily closed the safe and returned to organizing the papers on the desk, trying not to think too much about what she had just seen. However, the silence of the house was interrupted by a scream coming from downstairs. It was Victoria. "Emily, come here immediately!" Victoria's voice was loud, sharp, charged with an emotion Emily couldn't identify. She hurried down the stairs, finding Victoria in the living room, next to Sophie, who watched the scene with wide eyes. Victoria held an envelope in her hands, which seemed to contain incriminating evidence. "I knew it! I knew you were false all this time," Victoria accused, pointing a finger directly at Emily. The nanny was paralyzed for a moment, not understanding what was happening. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Reed?" asked Emily, trying to remain calm, but feeling the weight of Sophie's gaze upon her. Victoria opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of cash, displaying it as evidence of some terrible crime. "This money was in my safe. How do you explain it being hidden among your things in the guest room?" "Did you really think you could rob this family and get away with it?" Victoria's words were charged with indignation, but there was something in her tone that seemed carefully calculated. Emily was shocked. "That's not true. I would never touch the safe. I didn't even know what was inside." She looked at Sophie, hoping the girl would believe her, but Sophie's eyes were filled with confusion and fear. Victoria took a step forward, her face marked by an expression of false disappointment. "Don't try to deny it, Emily. I found the safe empty this morning and went straight to your room. You think you can live here, take advantage of James's generosity and still steal from our family?" She paused, as if waiting for Emily to confess. "I didn't do it. I would never do something like that," Emily protested, her voice trembling with the injustice of the situation. But before she could say anything else, 2 security guards from the house entered the room, apparently already summoned by Victoria. Let's take this to the authorities. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior, declared Victoria with a firmness that left no room for arguments. Emily looked at Sophie, hoping she would say something in her defense, but the girl was petrified, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Reed, please think carefully before doing this. I'm innocent. I have cared for Sophie with all love and dedication. I would never put this family at risk, Emily pleaded as the guards approached to escort her out. Victoria crossed her arms, a cold smile on her lips. The police will take care of this. I'm sure they'll find out the whole truth. And when that happens, you'll be held accountable. As Emily was led out of the house, tears began to stream down Sophie's face. Emily, I believe you, the girl whispered, but her voice was muffled by the tension in the room. Victoria placed a hand on the child's shoulder, as if to console her. But her touch seemed more like a barrier than a comfort. Minutes later, a police car arrived at the mansion. Emily tried to explain her innocence to the officers, but the evidence Victoria had planted was too incriminating. When the officers handcuffed her, the reality of the situation hit her hard. She was being accused of a crime she didn't commit, and there was nothing she could do at that moment to prove her innocence. On the way to the police station, Emily thought of Sophie. She knew the girl was confused, perhaps even scared, but she also knew that Sophie had a pure heart and that somehow she would find a way to uncover the truth. Emily closed her eyes, fighting against the despair that threatened to take over her. She knew she was entering a difficult battle, but she couldn't lose hope. In the mansion, Sophie walked away from Victoria, climbing the stairs in silence. The girl felt lost. She couldn't believe Emily was capable of something so horrible. Sitting on her bed, hugging one of the stuffed animals that Emily used to arrange, Sophie let the tears roll freely. Something inside her told her that this wasn't right, but she didn't know what to do to help. Meanwhile, Victoria, alone in the office, stared at the now empty safe. A satisfied smile appeared on her face. The plan had been executed perfectly. With Emily out of the way, she would have even more control over the house and James. The next step would be to ensure that Sophie turned completely against the nanny, consolidating her position as the only maternal figure in the girl's life. The crime was committed, and the consequences were beginning to take shape. Emily knew that proving her innocence would be an enormous challenge, but she also knew that Sophie and grandmother Margaret were her only hopes for justice. Emily was sitting in the back of the police car, her handcuffed hands resting in her lap. She looked out the window, trying to process what had just happened. The Wilson mansion, which had been her home for so long, now seemed a distant and inaccessible place. The feeling of injustice burned in her chest, but she knew that at that moment she had no way to prove her innocence. Her mind was focused on Sophie, on the devastated expression of the girl when she saw her being taken away. Inside the mansion, Sophie was in her room, sitting on the floor with her legs crossed and hugging one of the toys that Emily always arranged for her. Tears streamed silently down her face as the scene of the arrest replayed in her head. She had called out to Emily at the moment the officers took her away, but her voice seemed to have been lost in the chaos. Sophie wanted to run after her, to tell her that she believed her, but the words got stuck in her throat, choked by fear and confusion. Victoria, on the other hand, was in the living room talking to James on the phone. "Yes, the police are already dealing with it. It seems Emily has been stealing from us for some time," she said, with a tone that mixed indignation and false sadness. "Don't worry, dear. I'm taking care of everything. Sophie will get over this quickly. She just needs time." Victoria hung up, satisfied, as she looked out the window, watching the patrol car drive away down the tree-lined street. At the police station, Emily was led into a small interrogation room. She tried to remain calm as the officers asked questions about the money and the evidence found. "I didn't do it," Emily repeated, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "Someone is trying to frame me. I would never steal anything from the Wilson family. I love that girl as if she were my own daughter." Despite her sincere words, the officers' skeptical looks made it clear that her struggle was just beginning. Back in Sophie's room, the girl felt completely alone. Since her mother's death, Emily had been her safe haven, the person who was there to comfort her, listen to her, and love her unconditionally. Now Sophie didn't know how to fill that void. Looking at the bedroom door, she hoped Emily would come in at any moment, with that welcoming smile that made everything seem less scary. But the reality was that Emily wouldn't be coming back that night, and perhaps not for days to come. Why doesn't anyone believe her? Sophie whispered to herself, wiping away her tears with the sleeve of her pajamas. I know she wouldn't do that. I know. The conviction in her voice was clear, but she also knew she was just a child. What could she do to help? As night fell, Emily was taken to a temporary cell. The place was cold and impersonal, a cruel contrast to the warmth and love she had tried to build for Sophie. Sitting in a corner, her head leaning against the wall, Emily let a few tears escape. It wasn't for herself, but for Sophie. I need to be strong, she whispered to herself. For her. At the mansion, Sophie still couldn't sleep. The emptiness in the room seemed bigger than ever. She got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden where she had so often played with Emily. I'll help you, Emily, she murmured. I promise. The courtroom was completely silent when Emily Parker was led to the defendant's bench. Sitting next to her lawyer, she could barely hide the nervousness that had taken over her body. Her hands were clasped firmly in her lap, and her eyes desperately searched for a familiar face among the few people in the audience. The judge's stern expression, the indifferent looks of the jury, and the imposing presence of Victoria Reed seated in the witness stand made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Emily took a deep breath as the prosecutor rose to begin the session. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to examine a case of betrayal and theft, he began, his voice firm, echoing through the hall. The defendant, Emily Parker, a trusted nanny, had unrestricted access to the Wilson family's private life, and instead of valuing that trust, she decided to violate it by stealing a substantial amount of money from the residence's safe. Today we will bring forth compelling evidence and witnesses that will confirm her guilt. The prosecutor's words were like daggers for Emily, who struggled to maintain her composure. Her lawyer, an older man with an experienced air, placed his hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Stay calm, Emily. The truth will come out." But at that moment, the lawyer's words seemed more like an empty comfort than a true promise. Victoria was called to the witness stand. Elegant as always, she wore an impeccable dress and a discreet necklace, projecting the image of a trustworthy and moral woman. After swearing to tell the truth, Victoria began recounting the events with alarming confidence. "I never imagined something like this could happen in my own home," Victoria said, her voice laced with carefully rehearsed indignation. "Emily has always been a dedicated and attentive person. I never suspected anything until that day. I found the safe empty, and upon checking her room, I found a considerable amount of money hidden among her belongings. It was devastating to realize that someone we trusted so much could do something like that." The prosecutor approached Victoria, appearing empathetic. "Mrs. Reed, how did the discovery of this theft affect your family?" he asked, giving Victoria space to continue her performance. "It was a terrible blow," she replied, casting a calculated look at the jury. "My stepdaughter, Sophie, was very attached to Emily, and it affected her deeply. My husband, James, is devastated. He trusted her, we all trusted her. But the reality is that Emily betrayed us in a way we could never have imagined." Emily bit her lip, suppressing the urge to shout that everything was a lie. Every word from Victoria was a cruel distortion of the facts, but the impact of her testimony was evident. The jury listened attentively, absorbing every detail as if it were an unquestionable truth. Emily looked at her lawyer, who made a subtle gesture for her to remain calm. When it was the defense's turn, Emily's lawyer stood up and walked to the witness stand. "Mrs. Reed, you mentioned finding the money in my client's room. Could you describe exactly where you found that amount?" he asked, his voice calm but incisive. Victoria didn't hesitate. "It was hidden in a drawer of the dresser. When I saw the empty safe, I thought I should check if anything else had been taken, so I decided to check her room," she replied with an expression of false sadness. "Interesting," the lawyer continued, crossing his arms. "And did you have permission to enter my client's room and search her belongings?" Victoria frowned slightly but kept her composure. "I am Mr. Wilson's wife. It's my house. I have the right to ensure the safety of our family," she replied, averting her gaze for a brief moment. The lawyer seized the opportunity. "Mrs. Reed, don't you find it curious that you found the money hidden precisely in my client's room, a place where it would be too obvious to put it? Doesn't it seem strange that someone supposedly intelligent enough to rob a safe wouldn't bother to hide the money, in a less accessible location. Victoria paused but quickly recovered. "I can't speak for the mind of a criminal," she responded with a slightly defensive tone. Perhaps she was in a hurry or thought she would never be discovered. The tension in the room increased with each question. Emily felt a glimmer of hope as she saw the lawyer's line of reasoning, but Victoria was skilled at manipulating words. The way she expressed herself seemed carefully planned to avoid loopholes. "No further questions, Your Honor," said the lawyer, returning to his place. Emily let out a heavy sigh, but she knew Victoria's testimony had a strong impact. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the jury seemed inclined to believe the stepmother, whose impeccable image and convincing narrative weighed more than Emily's desperate denials. When Victoria stepped down from the witness stand, she cast a furtive glance at Emily, which seemed to carry a mix of anger and helplessness. The nanny knew she was being subjected to a cruel charade, but at that moment, with the system against her, she felt as though she was fighting a battle she had lost even before it began. The courtroom was in an almost palpable silence as the judge adjusted his glasses and opened the envelope with the verdict. Emily Parker, seated in the defendant's bench, felt her heart beating so fast that it seemed at any moment it would leap out of her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the table in front of her, but her mind was on Sophie, imagining how that little girl was coping with all of this. On the other side of the room, Victoria Reed displayed an expression of false compassion, but Emily knew that behind that look lay the satisfaction of seeing her plan reach its climax. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, his voice resonating throughout the room, "the jury has reached a decision." He paused for what seemed like an eternity before continuing. "Based on the evidence presented and the testimonies heard, the defendant, Emily Parker, is found guilty of the charges of theft and misappropriation, a crime which will initially result in life imprisonment." The words echoed in the courtroom like a blow. Emily felt the ground disappear from beneath her feet as tears began to roll down her face. She tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Her mind screamed that she was innocent, but at that moment no one seemed willing to listen. On the other side of the room, Sophie, who had been brought to hear the verdict alongside her father, couldn't hold back a loud sob that broke the silence of the court. "This can't be true," Sophie cried, her childlike voice reverberating in the heavy atmosphere. She rose from her chair and ran to her father, desperately tugging at the sleeve of his jacket. "Dad, please, you know Emily would never do this. She would never steal anything. Why are you believing these lies?" The girl cried as she clung to James' arm, who remained silent, staring ahead, unresponsive. James Wilson, known for his serious and professional demeanor, seemed torn between the cold logic of the evidence and his daughter's emotional outcry. He looked at Sophie, whose pleading eyes were flooded with tears, and then at Emily, who was being escorted away from the defendant's bench by officers. Guilt and doubt waged an internal battle in his mind. James wanted to believe in Emily's innocence, but the evidence presented at the trial, especially Victoria's testimony, was difficult to ignore. "Dad, please, say something. Why are you letting this happen?" Sophie cried again, her voice broken with emotion. She turned to the judge, who watched the scene with an expression of weariness. "Please, Your Honor, you can't do this to her. Emily is my best friend. She has taken care of me since Mom died." "She's not a thief," Sophie sobbed as she spoke, her words filled with the sincerity that only a child could display. The judge sighed and struck his gavel to restore order. "Miss Wilson, I deeply regret this, but this decision was based on the evidence presented. I know this is a difficult moment, but the laws exist to be upheld." He looked at the officers and signaled for them to continue escorting Emily away. As she was led away, Emily looked at Sophie, who was still clutching her father's arm. "Sophie, dear, I didn't do this. You have to believe me," Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. "I would never do anything to hurt you or your family." "I believe you, Emily," Sophie shouted, trying to break free from her father's grasp and run to her nanny. But James held her firmly. "I promise I'll prove you're innocent. I promise." The girl's words were cut off as the courtroom door closed, separating her from Emily. James crouched down to Sophie's level as she cried inconsolably. "Sophie, I know this is hard," he said, his voice sounding hesitant. "But the evidence, it points to Emily. We can't ignore what was presented in court." "You don't understand," Sophie cried, pulling away from him. You don't know anything about Emily. She truly loves me, and you're letting the stepmother destroy everything. Why can't you see what's happening?" Sophie's gaze was one of pure desperation, but there was also a spark of determination, something James couldn't help but notice. Victoria approached, feigning an expression of concern. "Sophie, dear, I know this is difficult for you, but we must accept reality. Emily betrayed us, and now she's paying for what she did," Victoria said, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. Sophie immediately recoiled, looking at Victoria with anger. "You're lying," she shouted. "You set this all up, didn't you? I know it was you." The accusation shocked James, who looked at Victoria, expecting some reaction. Victoria remained calm, but there was a slight tension in her face. "Sophie, that's absurd. I've always done everything for this family. I know you're upset, but it's unfair to make such accusations," she said, with a tone of false patience. Sophie didn't respond. She simply turned her back and ran out of the courtroom, leaving her father and stepmother behind. James watched her go, feeling a weight in his chest he didn't know how to alleviate. As much as he wanted to disregard his daughter's words, there was something in the intensity of her conviction that deeply unsettled him. In the temporary cell where Emily had been placed, she sat in a corner, hugging her knees. The memory of Sophie's face made her want to cry even more, but she knew she needed to be strong. "I can't give up," she murmured to herself. "I promised her I'd always be by her side. Somehow, I'll get out of here. I need to get out of here." Meanwhile, Sophie, sitting in the back seat of the car as James drove home, kept her gaze fixed out the window. She wouldn't say anything more. Within her mind, she had already made a decision. If no one else was going to do anything to help Emily, then she would find a way herself. No matter what it took, Sophie knew she couldn't let this injustice stand. Emily Parker was being led out of the courtroom, her wrists handcuffed and her head bowed. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Each step seemed to weigh a ton as she felt the gaze of the onlookers in the hallway. The feeling of humiliation was overwhelming, but what hurt most was the sight of Sophie, standing at the courthouse entrance, looking at her with a mixture of despair and determination. "Emily!" Sophie cried out, running towards the nanny before the officers could stop her. "You can't go, this is a mistake. I know you didn't do anything wrong." The girl's words were accompanied by uncontrollable tears, and she tried to hold Emily's hand, but the handcuffs hindered the gesture. "Sophie, I need you to be strong," Emily said. Her voice choked as she tried to convey calmness to the girl. "I didn't do this, and you know that, but now I need you to trust me. Everything will be all right." Emily struggled to sound confident, but the pain in her voice was evident. The officers, visibly uncomfortable with the scene, asked Sophie to step back. James Wilson, who had remained silent throughout the trial, finally intervened, gently pulling Sophie back. "Sophie, dear, let them do their job." "We can't do anything now," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Sophie turned to her father, her eyes shining with anger and hurt. "You're wrong, Dad. We can do something. You know she's innocent. Why are you letting this happen?" she shouted, her words echoing down the hallway. James averted his gaze, unable to meet the intensity of his daughter's anguish. "I promise I'll prove your innocence, Emily," Sophie declared, with an unexpected strength in her voice for someone so young. "I won't let this end like this." The girl's words made Emily's heart ache, but they also brought a glimpse of hope. Sophie was just a child, but her determination was evident, and Emily knew that the bond between them was stronger than any injustice. "I believe you, Sophie," Emily replied as she was led away by the officers. "Never forget that." Her eyes remained fixed on Sophie's until the moment the precinct doors closed, separating them completely. Outside the courthouse, Sophie remained silent, her hands clenched into fists. She looked at James and Victoria, who maintained her false expression of tranquility. Sophie knew that if she wanted to save Emily, she would have to act on her own. "This is not over," the girl muttered to herself, as the police car disappeared into the distance. Sophie was sitting on her bed, hugging one of the stuffed animals Emily used to arrange. The nanny's absence made the silence in the house even heavier, and Victoria's cold gaze, insisting on staying nearby, made Sophie feel suffocated. She knew something was wrong, but no one seemed to believe her. Determined to find a way to help Emily, Sophie decided to act on her own. That afternoon, while Victoria was busy in a meeting with one of the house decorators, Sophie went down to her stepmother's office. She knew she was taking a risk, but the desire to prove Emily's innocence was stronger than the fear of being caught. The office door was just ajar, and Sophie silently entered, closing it behind her. The room, with dark wood furniture and an immaculately organized desk, seemed cold and intimidating. Sophie began to look around, her eyes searching for something, anything, that could help her understand what was happening. As she approached Victoria's desk, she noticed a folder partially hidden under a stack of papers. With trembling hands, she pulled out the folder and opened it. Inside, she found a series of financial documents that seemed unusual. She didn't understand much about numbers, but some of the information caught her attention. One of the papers was a bank statement showing a significant transfer of money to an unknown account. Sophie frowned. Why would Victoria make such a large transfer? Another document appeared to be an authorization signed by James Wilson, but something about the signature seemed strange. Sophie had seen her father's signature many times, and this one looked different, as if it had been forged. She flipped through the papers quickly, trying to understand what they meant, until she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced. In haste, Sophie put the folder back in place and left the office as quietly as possible. Once she was safe in her room, she began to process what she had found. Those papers were not just suspicious. They could be the key to proving that Victoria was lying. But Sophie knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, and there was only one person she trusted as much as she trusted Emily: her grandmother, Margaret Wilson. Margaret was an experienced, shrewd woman, and above all, someone who always believed in Sophie. Without a second thought, Sophie picked up her phone and called Margaret. "Hello, dear. Is everything okay?" Margaret's warm voice immediately brought comfort to Sophie, but she knew she couldn't waste time. "Grandma, I need your help," Sophie said, trying to stay calm but unable to hide the urgency in her voice. "It's about Emily. I found something in Victoria's office, some strange papers. I think they can prove that Emily is innocent." Margaret was silent for a moment, absorbing what Sophie was saying. "Are you sure about this, Sophie? What kind of papers?" her grandmother asked, her voice becoming more serious. "I don't know exactly what they are, but it looked like money being transferred to another account. And I think Dad's signature was forged on one of them. I don't know what to do, Grandma. I just know Emily didn't do anything wrong and Victoria is hiding something," Sophie replied, almost breathless. Margaret took a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Listen, dear, I want you to stay calm. I'm coming over right away. Don't touch anything else for now, okay? Just wait for me." Sophie nodded, even though she knew her grandmother couldn't see her. "Please, Grandma, come quickly. I need you to see this. Emily needs us," she said, her voice almost breaking. "I'm on my way," Margaret assured her, with a determined tone that brought a thread of hope to Sophie's heart. "We'll figure this out together." Sophie hung up the phone and looked out her bedroom window, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She knew there was still a lot to uncover, but this was the first step in unmasking Victoria and saving Emily. Margaret Wilson arrived at the Wilson mansion in the early evening. The sky was tinged with shades of orange as the sun set, but she barely noticed the beauty of the landscape. Her mind was occupied with what Sophie had told her. Her granddaughter was clearly agitated and worried, and Margaret knew that to Sophie, Emily was much more than a nanny. She was practically a second mother. As soon as she entered the house, Margaret was greeted by Sophie, who came running down the stairs, urgently grasping her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, I'm so glad you came. Please come with me. I need to show you the papers I found in Victoria's office," the girl said, almost breathless. Margaret held her granddaughter's hand firmly, trying to calm her. "It's okay, dear. I'm here now." "Let's look at this together," she said, her voice serene but with a firmness that showed she was ready to take action. Sophie led her to her room, where she had hidden the folder she had taken from her stepmother's office. With trembling hands, the girl handed the documents to Margaret. The grandmother adjusted her glasses and began examining the papers. Margaret was a woman with vast experience in finance. For many years, she had worked as a financial consultant, managing important accounts and dealing with complex transactions. She knew exactly what to look for when it came to irregularities, and within minutes, she realized something was very wrong. "Look at this, Sophie," said Margaret, pointing to one of the documents. "Here is an extract from a bank account with a very high-value transfer. This account is not familiar to me. It's not one of your father's accounts, and I'm sure it's not a joint family account. Sophie leaned in to look more closely, though she didn't fully understand the numbers. Do you think this account is Victoria's? She asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. Margaret frowned as she analyzed it more deeply. It's possible, she replied in a careful tone. But what concerns me even more is this signature here. She held up one of the papers that appeared to be a financial authorization. Sophie, this signature is supposedly your father's, but it doesn't match his records that I know. There's something wrong here. Sophie felt a wave of hope growing in her chest. So you believe me? You think Victoria is involved in this? She asked, almost pleading for confirmation. Margaret looked into her granddaughter's eyes and nodded slowly. Yes, dear. There's something very suspicious here. These documents don't make sense. I can't say for sure yet, but it's highly likely that Victoria is hiding something. And if she forged your father's signature, that's very serious. Sophie let out a sigh of relief, but her expression soon turned serious. So what are we going to do, Grandma? How can we use this to help Emily? Margaret put the papers back into the folder and held Sophie's hands. The first step is to ensure these documents remain secure. We can't leave them where Victoria might find them. After that, we need to gather more information. If Victoria is involved in something like this, she's likely left other clues. And when we have enough evidence, we'll take it all to the authorities. Sophie nodded determinedly. I can help. I know where Victoria keeps some things in her office. There might be more papers like these. Margaret gave her granddaughter's hands a gentle squeeze. I appreciate your courage, Sophie, but we need to be careful. If Victoria suspects we're investigating, she might try to hide or destroy the evidence. We'll move with calm and intelligence. The grandmother and granddaughter spent the next few hours discussing what they had discovered. Margaret organized the documents in a logical order, identifying the most suspicious parts that could be used as evidence. She also made notes on a notepad she had brought with her, detailing her observations about the inconsistencies in the papers. Grandma, do you think Emily will be okay? Sophie asked, her voice full of concern. Margaret placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder and pulled her in for a hug. Yes, my dear. Emily is a strong woman, and she knows you're fighting for her. We'll figure this out together. I promise. As night fell, Margaret tucked the documents into her bag and gave Sophie clear instructions. Don't say anything about this to your father or Victoria for now. We still need more information before confronting them, and Sophie, be very careful. If you need me, call me immediately. Sophie nodded, feeling more confident with her grandmother's presence. For the first time in days, she felt there was a real chance to save Emily and expose the truth about Victoria. The two knew the path would be difficult, but they were willing to face it all together. Margaret sat on the couch of the small makeshift office in her home, with Sophie by her side, both leaning over the table as they analyzed the documents they had found. The grandmother had brought a laptop to check details of the suspicious transactions. Sophie, though young, observed everything attentively, absorbing every word and movement from her grandmother. It was during this careful analysis that Margaret found something even more concerning. Sophie, look at this, said Margaret, pointing to a note on one of the documents. It was a correspondence that seemed to have been sent to Victoria. The text, though brief, was direct. If you don't want the past to haunt you again, keep up with the payments. You know what I'm talking about. The message was signed only with the initials RC. Sophie frowned, trying to understand the meaning of that message. What does that mean, Grandma? Do you think someone is threatening Victoria? Margaret pursed her lips, pondering the implications. It looks like blackmail, she finally responded. Whoever this person is, they know something about Victoria that she doesn't want anyone to find out. And from what I can see, she's paying to keep it secret. The granddaughter tilted her head, intrigued. But what could she be hiding? Could it have something to do with what happened to Emily? Margaret took a deep breath, holding her chin in a pensive gesture. We can't be sure yet, but one thing is clear. Victoria is involved in something much bigger. This isn't just about Emily. Whoever is blackmailing her knows something very serious. If we can find out what it is, it might help us expose the truth. Sophie looked at the scattered papers on the table, her mind working quickly. Maybe these RCHs have more information. What if we try to find out who this person is? They could be someone who knows all of Victoria's secrets. Margaret nodded slowly, admiring her granddaughter's determination. "It's a good idea, Sophie, but we need to be careful. If Victoria finds out we're messing with this, she might destroy any evidence linking her to this blackmail. We need to act discreetly." As they continued discussing, Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The blackmail indicated that Victoria was not just manipulative, but someone with a dark past she would do anything to hide. Margaret knew this could be the key to unraveling Victoria's perfect facade and saving Emily from the injustice she was facing. "We'll find the truth," said Margaret, looking at Sophie with a firm expression. "And when we find all the answers, there will be no more hiding for Victoria." Sophie nodded, determined. "I'll do whatever I can to help. For her, for Emily." The revelation of the blackmail had given them a new purpose. As Sophie watched Margaret carefully organize the documents on the table, the weight of responsibility seemed to transform into determination. They knew the path would be dangerous, full of obstacles and uncertainties, but they were willing to go all the way to uncover what Victoria was hiding and, above all, prove Emily's innocence. Every step taken was driven by the love and justice they shared, and at that moment, nothing seemed more important than restoring the truth and protecting who truly mattered. Margaret and Sophie were sitting in the living room of the grandmother's house, surrounded by papers and notes organized in careful piles. The silence in the room was interrupted only by the sound of Margaret's laptop keyboard as she typed precisely, searching for any information that connected the evidence they already had to the blackmail involving Victoria. Sophie watched attentively, handing over documents whenever Margaret asked, her heart full of determination to prove Emily's innocence. "Grandma, there's something in this envelope you need to see," said Sophie, handing over a paper with folded creases. Margaret took the document and adjusted her glasses, examining the sheet carefully. It was a letter in a threatening tone, clearly part of the same series of messages they had found before. "Look at this, Sophie," said Margaret, pointing to a specific phrase. "If you fail the next payment, I'll make sure everyone knows what happened 5 years ago. You don't want that scandal to ruin your life." She paused, reflecting. "There's a clear pattern here. This person is using something very serious against Victoria, something she's desperate to keep secret." Sophie tilted her head, trying to connect the pieces. But what could have happened 5 years ago? "That was before she married Dad, right?" Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the letter. "Yes, this was before she joined your family. Whatever happened, it was big enough that she was willing to pay this person constantly. We need to find out who this blackmailer is and, more importantly, what they know." Sophie frowned, her face illuminated by determination. What if Victoria's real name is somewhere? She may have changed her identity to hide what she did. Margaret raised an eyebrow, impressed by her granddaughter's quick reasoning. "You may be right, Sophie. People who have something to hide often do that. Let's investigate old records and see if we can find anything about her. Any detail could be useful." The two worked together, alternating between laptop searches and analyzing the papers. Sophie scoured the documents carefully, while Margaret used her financial experience to interpret the bank records they had found. It was during one of these searches that Margaret noticed something unusual. "Sophie, look at this," she said, pointing to one of the transactions. "Here's a payment made to someone called Robert Carter. The initials are the same as the ones we saw on the letters. If this is the blackmailer, he may be the key to understanding what's going on." Sophie leaned in to look at the document, her eyes wide. "R.C. Like the signature on the letters. He must be the one blackmailing Victoria, but how can we find out more about him?" Margaret smiled slightly, her mind already plotting the next steps. "We can start by investigating that bank account and looking for public information about him. If he has a criminal record or is involved in something suspicious, it could lead us to more answers." Sophie stayed silent for a moment, watching her grandmother work. "Grandma, do you think this will be enough to save Emily?" she asked, her voice low but filled with hope. Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at her granddaughter seriously. "Dear, I know it seems like a difficult struggle now, but we're on the right path. Every piece of information we find brings us closer to the truth, and I promise you I won't rest until Emily is free and Victoria is unmasked." Sophie nodded, wiping away a stubborn tear that threatened to fall. "I won't give up either. Emily always told me that when something is important, we should fight for it. I'm going to fight for her. As they continued investigating, Margaret found another crucial clue. An address linked to Robert Carter's bank account indicated a small discreet property in the neighboring town. "Sophie, I think we've found a starting point," Margaret said, holding the paper with the address. "If he is the blackmailer, we may uncover more about what he knows." Their determination intensified. Each new clue seemed to strengthen the connection between Victoria and the blackmailer, giving them more confidence that they were on the right track. What Margaret and Sophie didn't know yet was that this investigation would put them at risk, but they were both willing to face anything to save Emily and expose the truth. Margaret and Sophie were in the grandmother's room, where they had set up an improvised space to continue their investigations. The room was filled with documents, notes, and an open laptop displaying suspicious financial records. The discovery of the name Robert Carter and the blackmail letters had given them a clear direction, but Margaret knew they needed something more concrete, something that couldn't be denied. "If we really want to unmask Victoria, we'll need visual evidence or something impossible to contest," Margaret said as she typed rapidly on the laptop. Sophie, sitting beside her, watched attentively. "Grandma, do you think the security cameras in the house could help?" Sophie asked, her face lit up by the sudden idea. Margaret stopped typing and looked at her granddaughter, surprised by the suggestion. "That's a great idea, Sophie. If we can access the recordings, we might be able to see who was really near the safe before they accused Emily. But that means we'll need to get into the house's camera system." Sophie frowned thoughtfully. "I know my dad's office has a monitor connected to the cameras. I've seen Victoria messing with that before. Maybe the recordings are still there." Margaret took a deep breath, weighing the risks. "It could be dangerous, dear. If Victoria or your dad catch us tampering with the recordings, it could complicate things further." Sophie shook her head determinedly. "It doesn't matter. I need to do this for Emily. She would do anything for me, and now it's my turn to help her." In the face of Sophie's determination, Margaret didn't have the heart to discourage her. "Okay," she said finally, "but we'll do this together. I'll help you access the recordings." Later that night, while the house was quiet, Margaret and Sophie discreetly made their way down to James's office. Sophie had discovered where her father kept the key to the cabinet where the security system was connected. Carefully opening the door, Margaret revealed a monitor and a control panel with buttons and cables. She adjusted her glasses and began examining the system. "It looks like there's a history of recordings stored here," Margaret said, as Sophie held the flashlight to illuminate the panel. "If we can access the days before Emily's accusation, we might be able to see what happened." Margaret navigated the menus carefully, trying not to leave any traces that they had accessed the system. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, the recordings from the previous week. She clicked on one of the files and the video began playing. On the monitor, the image of the room where the safe was located appeared. Margaret quickly forwarded to the day and time when the supposed theft had occurred. Sophie's heart raced as they watched. After a few minutes, a familiar figure appeared on the screen. Victoria. "Look," Sophie said, pointing at the monitor. "It's her. Victoria is in the office." The recording showed Victoria entering the room, looking around, and walking straight to the safe. She seemed to be alone, and her demeanor was careful, almost as if she were checking to make sure no one was around. Margaret advanced the video to follow Victoria's next moves. They watched with growing attention as the stepmother put a key into the safe, opened it, and removed its contents. "She's taking everything," Sophie whispered in disbelief. And then she said it was Emily. Margaret couldn't believe what she was seeing. The recording was clear, with an angle that showed Victoria tampering with the safe, emptying it, and hurrying out of the room. The grandmother knew that this recording was the proof they needed. "This is more than enough to prove Victoria was lying," Margaret said, a mix of relief and indignation. "She planted the money to frame Emily." Sophie clenched her fists in anger. She knew no one would suspect her. Everyone thinks she's perfect, but she's the real culprit. Margaret placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, trying to calm her. "You're right, dear. She manipulated everyone around her to get Emily out of the way. But now we have the truth. We need to save this recording before she finds out." Carefully, Margaret transferred the video to a USB drive she had brought with her. "Now we have what we need," she said, tucking the device into her jacket pocket. "But we need to be very careful from now on. If Victoria knows we have this recording, she might try to destroy the evidence. Sophie nodded determinedly. I'll protect it, Grandma. I promise. The two of them turned off the system and put everything back exactly as it was before. As they returned to Sophie's room, they carried not only the recording, but also a new hope. That proof could be the key to saving Emily and exposing Victoria once and for all. Victoria was sitting on the living room couch, a cup of coffee in her hands, when something caught her attention. The house, usually silent at that hour of the morning, seemed charged with a different energy. Her instinct told her that something wasn't right, and Victoria always trusted her instincts. Observing carefully, she noticed Sophie and Margaret coming down the stairs together in silence, exchanging complicit glances. "Good morning, girls," said Victoria with a controlled smile, but her eyes analyzed their every move. Sophie responded with a brief "good morning," without the usual energy that usually accompanied her greeting. Margaret, on the other hand, just nodded, keeping a neutral expression. Victoria immediately realized that something was out of the ordinary. After the brief interaction, Victoria remained silent, but her mind worked quickly. She knew that Sophie and Margaret had been spending a lot of time together in recent days. That in itself was not a cause for concern, but there was something about the way they avoided her presence that made her suspicious. Margaret, in particular, was sharper than Victoria cared to admit. Determined to find out what was going on, Victoria got up and went to her office. As she opened the door, she looked around carefully. Everything seemed to be in order, but as she approached the security camera panel, she noticed that something was different. The monitor was turned off, which was unusual, since she always left it on to facilitate access to the recordings. Victoria turned on the system and checked the records. As she navigated through the files, she realized that one of the previous days had been accessed recently. Her heart raced. Someone had tampered with the recordings. She didn't know who, but the suspicion immediately fell on Margaret and Sophie. Her mind began to work frantically, thinking of all the possibilities. "Those two are trying to meddle where they shouldn't," Victoria muttered to herself, her jaw clenched. She knew that if Margaret and Sophie had watched the recordings, it was possible they had found something incriminating. Victoria felt a wave of anger, but she also knew she needed to act carefully. She couldn't let her actions appear suspicious. As she left the office, Victoria found James in the hallway. "Darling, can we talk?" she said, adopting a sweet and concerned tone. "I'm starting to worry about your mother's influence over Sophie. They've been spending a lot of time together, and that may not be healthy. Sophie is confused about everything that's happened, and I think it would be good to limit your mother's access to her." James frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion, but Victoria continued. "I only want what's best for Sophie. You know I do everything for this family." Despite her words, Victoria's true intention was clear: to buy time and keep Margaret and Sophie away before they could act against her. Victoria knew she needed to increase her vigilance. The tension was rising, and she was determined to protect her secrets no matter the cost. Margaret sat at her dining room table, which now resembled an improvised investigation center more than anything else. Papers and documents were scattered in organized piles, alongside the flash drive containing the security camera footage. With a cup of tea by her side, she carefully reviewed every detail they had gathered so far. Her hands worked swiftly, but her mind was focused on a single goal: ensuring these pieces of evidence were solid enough to unmask Victoria and save Emily. As Margaret organized the documents, the phone rang. It was Sophie, who had just arrived at the police station to visit Emily. "Grandma, I'm here. They said I can only stay with her for 20 minutes, Sophie said, her voice sounding anxious and sad all at once. "Okay, dear," Margaret responded, trying to soothe her. "Use that time to comfort her and tell her we're close to figuring this out. Emily needs to know she's not alone." "I will, Grandma," Sophie promised. "And I'll tell her everything we're doing. She needs to know there's still hope." On the other end of the line, Margaret felt a tug at her heart. Sophie was dealing with a situation no child should face, but her courage was inspiring. Margaret hung up the phone and returned to her work, sorting the documents into categories: financial evidence, blackmail letters, and of course the video of the stepmother tampering with the safe. Each piece of information was an essential part of the puzzle. Meanwhile, Sophie was being led by a police officer to the visitor's room at the station. The environment was cold, with concrete walls and metal tables, but all of that faded from Sophie's mind as soon as she saw Emily enter through the door, accompanied by an officer. The nanny looked tired, with deep circles under her eyes and a haggard face, but her eyes lit up when she saw Sophie. "Emily!" Sophie ran to her, ignoring the rules about maintaining distance. She threw her arms around the nanny, who returned the embrace with force as if it were the only comfort she had felt in days. "Sophie, my dear, I was so worried about you," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you all right? How are things at the house?" Sophie pulled up a chair to sit across from the nanny. "I'm okay, Emily, and you? Are you eating? Are you resting?" The concern in the girl's voice was evident, but she quickly shifted her tone to bring hope. "Grandma and I are working to get you out of here. We've found important things, evidence that will show you're innocent." Emily blinked, surprised. "Evidence? What have you and your grandmother found, Sophie?" Sophie quickly explained about the financial documents, the blackmail letters, and finally the security camera footage showing Victoria tampering with the safe. "We have all of that, Emily. Grandma is organizing everything to take to court. Victoria isn't going to get away with this." Emily brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Sophie, you and your grandmother are doing all of this for me. I don't know how to thank you. I knew you believed me, but this..." The nanny couldn't finish the sentence, choked up with emotion. "You don't need to thank me," Sophie said, holding Emily's hand. "You've always been there for me, and now it's my turn to be there for you. I promise we're going to get you out of here." The police officer monitoring the room gave a gentle warning that time was almost up. Sophie felt the urgency rise. "Emily, stay strong. We're almost there. Grandma said we have the evidence we need, and I believe her. You're going to get out of here, I know it." Emily squeezed Sophie's hand, trying to convey all the gratitude and love she felt in that moment. "Thank you, Sophie. You're the bravest person I know. Please take care of yourself while I can't be there with you." When the time was up, Sophie gave Emily one last tight hug before being led back to the car. On the way home, she stared out the window, her thoughts swirling in her mind. More and more, she felt the responsibility to protect the evidence Margaret had gathered and ensure the truth would come to light. Meanwhile, Margaret finished reviewing the documents and put everything in a folder along with the flash drive. Every detail was now ready to be presented, but she knew the path would still be long. Looking at the clock, she sighed, knowing that despite all the progress, there was much at stake. But one thing was certain. They would not rest until Emily was released and Victoria faced the consequences of her actions. The next morning, Sophie was back at the police station, this time accompanied by Margaret, who had insisted on being present to ensure her granddaughter had the necessary support. The two were led again to the visitors' room, where Emily waited anxiously. When Sophie entered, her eyes lit up at seeing the nanny, but she also noticed the evident weariness on Emily's face, as if the days in prison were draining her energy. "Sophie, Margaret," Emily said with a weak but genuine smile as she stood up from the chair. Sophie ran to her, enveloping her in a tight hug. Margaret watched closely, her heart aching to see how the situation had affected the two of them. "Emily, are you okay?" Sophie asked, concerned. "We're working hard to get you out of here. Grandma organized all the evidence, and I know we'll be able to prove your innocence." Emily sat down again and held the girl's hands. "I'm okay, Sophie, or at least as okay as I can be in here. But knowing that you're by my side and fighting for me, that's what gives me strength," she replied, her voice laden with emotion. Margaret, who had been silent until then, decided to intervene. "Emily, Sophie told me about everything you went through before this happened. I think it's important for us to know everything you noticed or suspected. The more information we have, the easier it will be to build a solid case." Emily hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath, seeming to make a decision. She looked at Sophie and then at Margaret, and her expression became serious. "I never wanted to say anything because I had no proof, but I always suspected Victoria," she began, her voice low and full of caution. Sophie's eyes widened. "You suspected her, Emily? Why?" asked the girl, leaning forward, completely attentive. "From the beginning, when she arrived at our house, something about her didn't seem right," explained Emily. "Victoria was always very polite and smiling in front of your father, Sophie, but there were moments when she showed another facet. I saw her mistreating some household staff, being rude and even threatening. At first I thought it was just her way, but then I began to realize that she was much more calculating than she seemed. Margaret crossed her arms, watching attentively. Do you think she was already planning something from the beginning? Emily nodded, a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. I don't know if it was something specific, but Victoria has always been very controlling. She wanted to know everything that happened in the house, even things that didn't concern her, and there were moments when she seemed worried, as if she were hiding something. Sophie held Emily's hand tightly. Why didn't you ever tell me this? I could have helped. Emily smiled slightly and caressed the girl's face. I didn't want to worry you, dear. You had already been through so much with the loss of your mother. Besides, without proof, it would have been just my word against hers, and I knew your father trusted Victoria completely. Margaret frowned, processing the information. And about the safe. Had you noticed anything strange before being accused? Emily shook her head. Not directly. I knew the safe existed, but I never had access to it. However, sometimes I saw Victoria entering the office at odd hours. It was always very late at night or when she knew no one would be around. So I thought it was strange, but again, without proof, I couldn't do anything. Sophie seemed indignant. So she had been planning all this for a long time. She used you as a scapegoat to clear any suspicion from herself. Emily pursed her lips and nodded. That's what I realized when everything happened. When she accused me, it seemed like she had already planned everything. And now, knowing that you found the camera recordings, it confirms my suspicions. She knew no one would suspect her, especially since your father always believed everything she said. Margaret sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the situation. Emily, this information you're giving us is crucial. That shows Victoria's pattern of behavior, which can be used against her. Don't worry, we're gathering every piece of this story to ensure the truth comes out. Emily looked at Margaret with gratitude, her eyes glistening. Thank you, Margaret. I don't know how to repay what you and Sophie are doing for me. Sophie shook her head vigorously. You don't have to repay anything, Emily. You took care of me like no one else. Now it's my turn to take care of you. The police officer monitoring the room gave the warning that time was running out. Emily gave Sophie one last hug, holding her as if she were her anchor amidst the storm. Stay safe, Emily said, looking at both of them, and keep believing. This is what will keep us strong. As Sophie and Margaret left the police station, they were more determined than ever. Each piece they put together from Victoria's story only reinforced their purpose to fight until the end, to free Emily and expose the whole truth. Margaret and Sophie were sitting in the grandmother's living room, surrounded by the organized documents and the pen drive with the recording that incriminated Victoria. The atmosphere was charged with tension, but also with a shared determination. Both knew they had gathered enough evidence to unmask Victoria, but they also understood that the next step would be the most difficult, bringing it all to court. Grandma, we have to tell everything to the judge, said Sophie, her voice firm despite her young age. People need to know what Victoria did. If we don't do it soon, she might try to destroy the evidence or make up another lie. Margaret sighed, looking at her granddaughter with pride and concern. I know, dear, but we need to be careful. The court is a serious place, and the evidence we have must be presented correctly. If we make a mistake, Victoria could use it against us. Sophie frowned, clearly impatient. But the longer we wait, the more Emily suffers. It's not fair. She's imprisoned for something she didn't do, and Victoria is here acting as if she's innocent. I can't stand it. Margaret held Sophie's hands, trying to calm her. I understand how you feel, Sophie. And I promise we won't wait any longer than necessary. We'll bring everything to court, but we need to do it at the right moment. First, we need to make sure everything is perfectly organized. Once we put this before the judge, there will be no going back. As Margaret spoke, Sophie began to think of Emily, imagining her alone in the cold cell, unaware that the truth was about to be revealed. The image made her heart ache, but it also reinforced her determination. I will tell everything. Even if no one believes me at first, I'll make them listen, no matter what happens. Margaret observed the determination in her granddaughter's eyes and nodded. Very well, Sophie. If you're ready for this, we'll do it together, but I want you to know that I'll support you every step of the way. No matter what happens in court, you won't be alone. Sophie looked at her grandmother and smiled, feeling stronger. Thank you, Grandma. That means a lot to me. Margaret picked up the folder containing the documents and the flash drive. "So it's decided. Tomorrow we're presenting everything to the court. We'll show the recordings, the financial documents, and the blackmail letters. And when the truth comes out, Victoria won't have anywhere else to run." At that moment, the two of them felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the hope that they were finally close to freeing Emily. The plan was laid out, and now it was just a matter of moving forward, united by their determination to do justice. The morning was clear, but the atmosphere in the Wilson mansion was tense. Sophie was in her room, finishing getting ready for court. She knew this would be a decisive day for Emily, and nothing would stop her from being there to reveal the truth. However, her determination was interrupted by a knock on the door, followed by Victoria's entrance with a smile that seemed more like a mask. "Sophie, dear, can I talk to you for a moment?" Victoria asked, her voice honeyed. Without waiting for an answer, she entered the room and closed the door behind her. Sophie immediately felt the tension in the air but kept her composure. "I'm busy, Victoria," Sophie replied, adjusting her coat. "I have something very important to do today." Victoria approached, crossing her arms as she watched the girl. "I know you want to go to court, but I don't think it's a good idea, dear. This is an adult matter, and I don't want you to get involved in something that could be, uncomfortable." Sophie stopped what she was doing and looked directly at Victoria. "Uncomfortable for whom? For you?" she asked, with a frankness that surprised Victoria. The stepmother took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Sophie, I'm just thinking about your well-being. You're too young to get involved in this kind of situation. Besides, you've been through a lot in the last few months. Don't you think it would be better to stay home and rest? We can even do something special together if you'd like." Sophie narrowed her eyes, feeling the manipulation behind Victoria's sweet words. "You don't want me to go because you know what I'm going to say there. I know what you did, Victoria. I know it was you who set everything up against Emily." For a brief moment, Victoria lost her composure but quickly regained her fake smile. "Sophie, that's absurd. I've always done my best to take care of you and your family. Now please be reasonable. Don't let these confused ideas pull you away from me." Before Sophie could respond, the bedroom door opened and Margaret entered, her gaze as sharp as a blade. "What's going on here?" the grandmother asked, immediately sensing the tension in the room. Victoria turned to Margaret, trying to maintain her poise. "Oh, Margaret, I was just talking to Sophie. I was suggesting that maybe it would be better for her not to go to court today. After all, she's just a child, and I don't want her to be exposed to something so stressful." Margaret crossed her arms, looking at Victoria as if she could see right through her. "Sophie has more courage and maturity than many adults I know, and she has the right to fight for Emily, someone she loves and who has been falsely accused." Victoria tried to argue. "I just want to protect her, Margaret, that's all." "Protect who, Victoria, Sophie or yourself?" Margaret shot back, her voice firm. "I know exactly what you're trying to do, but let me be clear. You're not going to stop Sophie from telling the truth. She has the right to be there, and no one, not even you, is going to take that away from her." Victoria stepped back slightly, realizing she wouldn't win that confrontation. "Very well, if that's what you want," she said, with a sour tone, before leaving the room and slamming the door shut. Sophie looked at Margaret, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandma. I knew she would try to stop me." Margaret smiled and placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "You're very brave, dear, and I'll be by your side the whole time. Don't worry about Victoria. What matters is that today we're going to reveal the truth and save Emily." As they prepared to leave, Sophie felt a new wave of determination. She knew the day would be difficult, but with Margaret by her side, she felt she could face anything. The truth was about to come out, and nothing, not even Victoria, could stop them. Margaret and Sophie were sitting at the large dining table in the grandmother's house, which now seemed more like an improvised office. Piles of papers, notes, and the flash drive with the video recording were scattered before them. The sunlight streaming in through the windows seemed dimmer, as if reflecting the tension and weight of the moment. They both knew that what they would do the next day could change everything, not just for Emily, but for the dynamics of the Wilson family. "Sophie, we need to review every detail before we take this to court," said Margaret, adjusting her glasses as she examined the documents once again. Her voice was firm, but there was a hint of concern. She knew any mistake could jeopardize the entire case. Each piece of evidence needs to be organized logically, so the judge and jury clearly understand what we're presenting. Sophie, sitting next to her grandmother, watched the papers intently, trying to absorb everything she could. "Grandma, what if they don't believe us? What if Victoria manages to lie and convince everyone that she didn't do anything wrong?" the girl asked, her voice laden with anxiety. Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at Sophie, her eyes conveying a calm that contrasted with the chaos around them. "Dear, the truth has a strength that no lie can hide forever. We have solid evidence, the financial documents, the blackmail letters, and most importantly, the security camera footage. This evidence speaks for itself." Sophie nodded slowly, but still seemed uneasy. "I just want Emily to come home. She doesn't deserve to be in that horrible prison. She always took care of me, Grandma. She always put me first, even when she was tired or sad." Margaret placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know, Sophie. And that's why we're doing this. Emily is a wonderful person and she needs to know she's not alone. She deserves justice and we're going to make sure she gets it." The two continued organizing the documents, creating a clear timeline to present the evidence in court. Margaret explained each item to Sophie, ensuring the girl understood what they were doing. Sophie paid attention, but her thoughts often drifted back to Emily, imagining how she must be feeling at that moment. After some time, Margaret closed the folder containing the evidence and placed the flash drive in a secure pocket in her bag. "Done," she said with a sigh of relief. "Everything is in order. Now we just need to trust the process." Sophie looked at Margaret and suddenly felt the need to say something she had been keeping in her heart. "Grandma, thank you for believing me. I know you could have let this go, but you didn't. And I know Emily will be very grateful too." Margaret smiled, visibly moved. "Dear, you're the reason I'm doing this. Your determination and courage are inspiring. And I know your mother would be very proud of you." The words of Margaret brought tears to Sophie's eyes. She stood up and walked around the table to hug her grandmother, who reciprocated the gesture affectionately. The two remained like that for a few moments, finding strength in each other to face what was to come. After some time, Sophie pulled away and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Do you think Emily knows how much we love her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sure she does," Margaret replied, holding Sophie's hands. "And tomorrow, when she knows everything we've done to help her, she'll realize even more how important she is to us." Sophie smiled, though her eyes were still moist. "I just hope the judge sees it too, that he sees Victoria is the real culprit." Margaret nodded. "The truth always finds a way to prevail, Sophie. And with everything we've gathered, I believe we have a real chance to prove what happened." As the day ended, the two decided to rest before the big day. Sophie went upstairs to her room, but she couldn't stop thinking about everything that was to come. She knew things could go wrong, but she was determined to do everything in her power to help Emily. Downstairs, Margaret carefully put away the documents, making sure they were secure. She knew the next day would be one of the most important in their lives, but she felt a mix of pride and hope. Sophie was showing a strength that Margaret knew came from the love she felt for Emily, a love that not even Victoria's lies could destroy. Before going to bed, Margaret looked out the window at the starry sky. "Tomorrow will be a decisive day," she whispered to herself, "and we'll be ready." The night was quiet, but the atmosphere in Margaret's house was anything but calm. Sophie was in her room, sitting on the bed with her legs crossed, her gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the stars shone, but she could barely appreciate them. Her mind was occupied with the next day's trial. She knew everything depended on that moment, and the tension made her clutch the small stuffed bear Emily had given her years ago. Downstairs, Margaret was in the living room, reviewing the documents and the pen drive with the recording for the 10th time. She was determined to ensure everything was perfect. Her experience told her that any flaw could be used against them, and she couldn't take that risk. With each sigh, she felt the weight of responsibility increase. This was not just about justice for Emily. It was about protecting Sophie and the family's integrity. Margaret finally closed the folder with the evidence and placed it inside a bag, carefully zipping it shut. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past 11 at night, but sleep seemed like a distant thing. Her mind insisted on going over every detail of the plan. As she mentally organized the next steps, she heard light footsteps on the stairs. Sophie appeared at the doorway, her gaze hesitant. "Grandma, are you still awake?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes, dear. I couldn't sleep," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "And you? What are you doing awake at this hour?" Sophie entered the room and sat down next to her grandmother on the couch. "I can't stop thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow. What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if Victoria manages to fool everyone again?" Margaret put her arm around her granddaughter and pulled her close. "Sophie, it's normal to feel afraid, especially before something so important. But you need to remember that we're doing everything we can. We have solid evidence and the truth is on our side. The rest is in the judge's hands." Sophie lowered her head, clutching the teddy bear against her chest. "I just want Emily to come home. It's not fair what they're doing to her." Margaret held Sophie's chin and made her look into her eyes. "I know it seems difficult now, but you've been incredibly brave. Tomorrow you'll have a chance to show the world how much Emily means to you. That's more powerful than any lie Victoria can tell." Sophie nodded slowly, finding some comfort in her grandmother's words. "I'll do it, Grandma. No matter what happens, I'll fight for her." The two remained silent for a few moments, just feeling the weight of the moment. Finally, Margaret kissed Sophie's forehead. "Now go get some rest, dear. Tomorrow will be a long day, and you need to be strong." Sophie stood up and hugged her grandmother before going back upstairs to her room. Margaret sat on the couch for a few more minutes, looking at the bag with the evidence. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and murmured to herself, "We're ready. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The courtroom was full, but the silence was almost deafening. Margaret and Sophie entered together, passing the crowded benches of people waiting for the start of the final hearing. Margaret held Sophie's hand firmly, while the girl looked around, trying to stay calm. She knew that what would happen there would define Emily's future, and the weight of that responsibility was etched on her face. On the other side of the room, Victoria Reed entered with an impeccable posture, radiating confidence. Dressed in an elegant suit and discreetly made up, she greeted the lawyers and even some onlookers with rehearsed smiles. To those who didn't know the truth, Victoria seemed the image of an innocent and wronged woman, fighting to protect her family. "Don't worry, dear," Margaret whispered to Sophie as they took their seats. "She may seem confident now, but the truth is on our side. And when the truth comes out, there's no disguise that can protect her." Sophie nodded, trying to ignore Victoria's piercing gaze, who was now seated next to her lawyer, idly fiddling with a folder. The stepmother flashed a cold smile towards the girl, as if she wanted to show that she had already won. Sophie averted her gaze, feeling a wave of nervousness, but Margaret's firm grip on her hand brought her some comfort. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. He was a serious-looking man with graying hair and a rigid posture that conveyed authority. When everyone sat back down, he adjusted his glasses and began to speak. "We are here for the final hearing in the case of Emily Parker, accused of theft and misappropriation. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their arguments before a final decision is made." Victoria maintained her serene expression as the prosecutor stood up and began to describe the case. He reaffirmed the charges against Emily, highlighting the circumstantial evidence presented earlier, including the money found in her belongings and Victoria's testimonies. As he spoke, Margaret noticed that Victoria barely blinked, as if she was completely sure that the case was settled in her favor. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said emphatically, "the defendant's behavior demonstrates a breach of trust that cannot be ignored. We believe the evidence presented is more than sufficient to sustain a conviction." From the defendant's bench, Emily kept her head down, but her hands were firmly clasped in her lap. Sophie watched her with sadness, wishing she could run up to her and assure her that everything would be all right. But Sophie knew she had to wait for the right moment. After the prosecutor finished, it was the turn of Emily's defense attorney to stand up. He was a middle-aged man with a confident but respectful demeanor. "Your Honor, before proceeding with our argument, I would like to highlight that new evidence has emerged that we believe is crucial to this case. We request the opportunity to present it during this hearing." The judge frowned, visibly interested. "New evidence? Why wasn't it presented earlier?" "We received this evidence recently," the lawyer explained, "and we believe it can shed new light on the events that led to my client's arrest." Victoria, who until that moment had seemed unshakable, shifted slightly in her seat. Although she still maintained her confident smile, Margaret noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she held a pen to take notes. The stepmother knew something was coming, but she couldn't predict the impact. "Proceed," said the judge, signaling for the defense to continue. The lawyer turned to Margaret and Sophie, who were seated in the front row. "Your Honor, I would like to request permission for Sophie Wilson, Victoria Reed's stepdaughter, and Margaret Wilson, Mr. James Wilson's mother, to present their findings as witnesses in this hearing." Victoria froze, her gaze going straight to Sophie, who was now standing up next to Margaret. The smile disappeared completely, replaced by an expression of alertness. She tried to disguise it, but her eyes betrayed her. There was fear there, though she tried to hide it. "Permission granted," said the judge, motioning for both of them to approach. Margaret and Sophie walked to the center of the courtroom, where the microphones were. Margaret carried the bag with the documents and the pen drive, while Sophie clenched her fists by her side, gathering all the courage she had. Before speaking, Margaret looked at her granddaughter, as if giving her one last silent encouragement. As they prepared to present the evidence, Victoria crossed her arms and looked at her lawyer, clearly uneasy. For the first time, her facade began to crumble, and the confidence she exuded at the beginning of the hearing seemed to slowly drain away. From the defendant's bench, Emily raised her eyes, feeling a spark of hope at seeing Margaret and Sophie ready to confront Victoria. This was the moment of truth, and everything indicated that fate would finally begin to change in her favor. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electrifying. The tension in the air was palpable as Margaret and Sophie stood before the judge, with the folder containing the evidence in Margaret's hands. All eyes were fixed on them, especially Victoria's, who now displayed a nervousness that was increasingly difficult to hide. Sophie, only 11 years old, seemed much smaller in the grandeur of the room and the weight of the situation, but there was something in her eyes that caught everyone's attention: pure determination. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at Sophie. "Miss Wilson," he said, his voice grave and laden with authority, "are you aware of the seriousness of this hearing? And are you prepared to tell the truth?" Sophie took a step forward, lifting her chin with courage. "Yes, Your Honor," she responded, her voice clear but with a slight tremble that showed the emotion of the moment. "I know what's at stake, and I came here to tell everything I know. No matter what happens, I need the truth to be heard." Victoria, sitting with her lawyer by her side, clenched her fists. She knew Sophie was about to reveal something important, and no matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure, she couldn't hide the glimmer of worry in her eyes. "Proceed, Miss Wilson," said the judge, encouraging her. Sophie took a deep breath, glanced quickly at Margaret, who gave her an encouraging nod and began to speak. "I'm here because I know Emily is innocent. She never stole anything." Victoria made it look like it was her, but the truth is that Victoria is the one who's guilty. Her words caused a murmur in the courtroom, which was quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The prosecutor stood up, frowning. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is just the word of a child. Where is the evidence to support this accusation?" Margaret, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward and raised her folder. "Your Honor, my granddaughter and I have gathered substantial evidence showing that the accusation against Emily was a setup orchestrated by Victoria Reed. We have included financial documents, blackmail letters, and even a video recording." The judge frowned, visibly intrigued. "A video recording? Explain." Margaret handed the flash drive to the court officer, who took it to the technician responsible for displaying the evidence. "Your Honor, this recording was taken from the security cameras at the Wilsons' home. It clearly shows Victoria Reed accessing the safe, removing its contents, and then hiding the money elsewhere. This happened shortly before Emily was accused." As the technician prepared the video, Sophie continued, "I saw Victoria messing around in the office several times. She always seemed to be hiding something. So when they said Emily had stolen, I knew something was wrong. Emily would never do that. She loves me and she loves our family." The judge nodded to the technician, who finally played the video. On the screen, the security camera footage showed Victoria entering the office at an unusual hour. The recording clearly captured the moment when she opened the safe, removed the money and looked around, as if checking for witnesses. The entire courtroom held its breath as they watched the scene unfold. "This proves nothing," Victoria's lawyer said, quickly standing up. "My client has access to the safe because she's part of the family. That doesn't mean she stole anything." Margaret crossed her arms and looked directly at the lawyer. "With all due respect, we also have financial documents showing suspicious transfers made shortly after this incident. Additionally, we found blackmail letters sent to Victoria demanding she make payments or face the exposure of a past scandal." The court officer handed the letters to the judge, who began reading them carefully. The words written on the papers made it clear that Victoria was being blackmailed by someone who knew a compromising secret. Sophie watched the judge's expression change as he read, feeling a glimmer of hope grow in her chest. Victoria, on the other hand, was losing control. She tried to stand up, but her lawyer pulled her back into her seat. "This is a conspiracy," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was loud, almost hysterical. "This child and this woman are trying to frame me. This is outrageous." The judge banged his gavel to restore order. "Ms. Reed, I suggest you maintain your composure. The evidence is being presented, and it is up to the court to decide." Sophie stepped forward again, her eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, Victoria has always tried to manipulate me, but I know the truth. Emily is like a mother to me, and she would never do anything to hurt our family. Please believe us." The judge looked at Sophie for a long moment before turning his attention back to Margaret. "Mrs. Wilson, the evidence you have presented is compelling. However, we still need to hear the testimonies from the prosecution before reaching a final conclusion." Margaret nodded, keeping her composure. "We understand, Your Honor. All we ask is that this evidence be examined fairly." The courtroom was completely silent as the judge announced a recess to review the evidence presented. Sophie returned to the bench beside Margaret, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew they had done everything they could, but now Emily's fate was in the hands of the court. Victoria remained silent, but the look of panic on her face was evident. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her lies were about to be exposed. Margaret and Sophie exchanged a complicit look, knowing that regardless of the outcome, they had fought with everything they had. Sophie, seated next to Margaret, looked at Victoria with a mixture of indignation and disbelief. How could she continue lying, even in the face of such compelling evidence? Sophie clenched her hands into fists, but Margaret placed her hand over hers as a silent reminder that the truth was on their side. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at Victoria, his expression unwavering. "Mrs. Reed, the recording clearly shows you accessing the safe at a time when, according to previous testimonies, only the accused, Emily Parker, was being considered a suspect. Can you explain why you were there?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, trying to reorganize her thoughts. I was just checking to make sure the safe was secure," she said, trying to sound confident. "With everything that was happening in the house, it was my responsibility to ensure there were no issues." The prosecutor stood up, crossing his arms. "And you checked the safe alone, without informing Mr. Wilson or any other member of the household, even knowing that an alleged theft had already been reported?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the prosecutor didn't give her the chance. He pointed at the monitor, where the video was still frozen on the image of Victoria holding the money from the safe. "Furthermore, Mrs. Reed, if you were merely checking the safe, why did you remove its contents? That's not something someone would do just to check." The courtroom murmured in agreement, and the judge banged his gavel to restore order. Victoria began to lose her composure. "This is a conspiracy," she shouted, pointing at Margaret and Sophie. "They're trying to frame me because they don't accept that I'm part of this family." Margaret remained calm, but her voice cut through the air like a blade. "No one is framing you, Victoria. You did that yourself. The evidence speaks for itself." The judge raised his hand, calling for silence. He looked at Victoria with gravity. "Mrs. Reed, the evidence presented is clear. If you have no other plausible explanation, the court will have to consider the conclusions that this evidence suggests." Victoria felt the pressure mounting around her. Her eyes searched for the lawyer, but he only shook his head, unable to find a way out. For the first time, Victoria's mask of confidence seemed to be crumbling completely, as the lies she had worked so hard to maintain turned against her. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Victoria Reed, once exuding confidence, was now visibly shaken. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the judge, the prosecutor, and occasionally Margaret and Sophie, who remained seated, firm and determined. The security camera footage and the documents presented by the grandmother and granddaughter had initiated the dismantling of her perfect facade. But what was to come was the final blow. The prosecutor stood up again with a new folder of documents in hand. He walked to the center of the courtroom and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present further evidence that connects Ms. Reed to a financial scheme involving not only the manipulation of the Wilson family's vault, but also illegal bank transactions and extortion carried out by third parties." The judge nodded, indicating that he should proceed. The prosecutor opened the folder and handed the documents to the court officer, who quickly took them to the judge. These documents show a series of bank transfers made by Ms. Reed to an account linked to an individual named Robert Carter. This name appears repeatedly in the extortion letters that were previously presented by Margaret Wilson. The transfers coincide with the dates mentioned in the letters, suggesting that Ms. Reed was being extorted. Victoria pursed her lips, visibly uncomfortable, but the prosecutor continued. "Although being extorted is not a crime in itself, what matters here is the motive. The letters indicate that the extortionist was threatening to reveal a scandal related to Ms. Reed. And, Your Honor, this evidence directly connects her behavior to the framing of Emily Parker." He paused for emphasis, as the words hung in the room. "We believe that in order to ensure that attention was diverted from herself, Ms. Reed manipulated the evidence and used the accusation against Emily as a smokescreen. The footage clearly shows that she had access to the vault, and the financial documents suggest that she was diverting funds to deal with this extortion." Victoria stood up abruptly, slamming her hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here. This man, Robert Carter, was threatening me. I had no choice." Her voice, once controlled, was now filled with desperation. The prosecutor turned to her, impassive. "Ms. Reed, if you were being extorted, why didn't you seek help from the authorities? Why didn't you inform Mr. Wilson or anyone trustworthy in the family? Instead, you chose to incriminate Emily Parker, a woman who dedicated years of her life to caring for this family." Victoria tried to respond, but her words were drowned out by the murmurs of the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel again, demanding order. "Ms. Reed, maintain your composure. The court is hearing the evidence. If you wish, you may present your defense at the appropriate time." Margaret took the opportunity to stand up, with Emily's lawyer's consent. "Your Honor, may I add something?" she asked. After the judge nodded, Margaret looked directly at Victoria. Ms. Reed knew exactly what she was doing. From the moment she entered this family, she manipulated situations to gain James Wilson's trust, while undermining anyone who could expose her intentions. Emily was just the most convenient target, because Victoria knew no one would expect her to be capable of such cruelty. Margaret's words pierced the room like knives. Victoria tried to counter, but was cut off by the judge. "Mrs. Wilson, your allegations are serious. Please continue." Margaret took a step forward. "The evidence is all here, Your Honor. The footage, the financial documents, the letters. Everything points to the fact that Ms. Reed not only stole from the family vault, but also manipulated evidence to save her own skin. She pinned the blame on Emily because she knew Emily had no means to defend herself." The prosecutor took the cue and spoke again. "Your Honor, furthermore, we have testimonies from former household staff recounting Ms. Reed's intimidating behavior, especially toward Emily. This reinforces the pattern of manipulation and intimidation she employed." Cornered, Victoria finally exploded. "All of this was Robert Carter's fault. He threatened to destroy my life, ruin everything I had built. I only did what I had to do to protect myself." The judge frowned, observing her carefully. "Ms. Reed, the court understands the gravity of the extortion, but that does not justify framing someone else and misappropriating family resources. Your actions were deliberate and caused serious harm." Victoria sank back into her chair, defeated. She looked at Sophie, who was now standing beside Margaret. The girl's eyes were filled with determination, and her expression made it clear that there was no longer any room for Victoria's lies. The judge paused, flipping through the evidence presented before saying, "The court finds the new evidence extremely relevant. We will continue the examination during the next segment of the hearing, but I must say that the evidence so far paints a very unfavorable picture for Ms. Reed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge once again demanded silence. Victoria sat, her face pale and eyes glazed over, as the truths she had worked so hard to conceal finally came to light. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to have changed completely. James Wilson, who until that moment had remained silent on the bench reserved for the family, now seemed to be gripped by an avalanche of emotions. The security camera footage, the financial documents, and the extortion letters had created an indisputable narrative, and he was finally beginning to see what everyone around him already knew. Victoria Reed had lied, manipulated, and destroyed the trust he had placed in her. As the judge reviewed the documents and the discussions in the courtroom momentarily ceased, James rose from his seat and walked slowly to where Emily was sitting on the defendant's bench. His steps were hesitant, as if each one required a monumental effort. When he stopped before her, his eyes were brimming with a guilt that seemed to grow with every passing second. "Emily," his voice broke as he said her name. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotion. "I don't even know where to begin. I was so blind. I trusted Victoria and ignored everything you've always done for me and my daughter." Emily looked up, surprised and confused. Since the beginning of that nightmare, James had remained distant, apparently believing every word uttered by Victoria. Seeing him there now seemed surreal. "Mr. Wilson," she began, but he raised his hand slightly, asking her to let him continue. "Please let me speak," said James, his voice choked up. He knelt beside her, something no one in the courtroom expected. "I made a terrible mistake. I wrongly accused you. I chose to believe lies because it was easier than facing the truth. You were part of our family, Emily, and I betrayed you." James's words made Emily close her eyes for a moment, as if she were trying to process everything. She felt a mix of emotions. Relief at finally hearing what she had always wanted him to realize, but also pain, because all of this could have been avoided. "I only did what anyone would do for Sophie," Emily finally responded. Her voice was low but steady. "She's like a daughter to me. I would never do anything that could harm you or your family, and yet I was treated like a criminal." James nodded slowly, tears now streaming down his face. "You have every right to feel that way. I failed you. I have no excuses for what I did, but I want you to know that I deeply regret it. If there is any way to fix this, anything, I will do it." Margaret, who was watching the scene closely, saw the sincerity in James's eyes and decided to intervene. She stood up and placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "Emily, he's trying to do the right thing now. We can't change what happened, but we can decide how we move forward." Emily looked at Margaret, then at James, and finally at Sophie, who was watching it all with teary eyes. "Sophie," Emily said softly, calling the girl over. "Come here." Sophie ran to her, and Emily enveloped her in a tight hug. "You were so brave," Emily whispered. "Without you and your grandmother, none of this would have been possible. I don't know how to thank you." Sophie sobbed, hugging her even tighter. "I would never let them do this to you, Emily. You've always taken care of me, and now it was my turn to take care of you." James, witnessing the moment between the two, felt the weight of guilt intensify. He knelt beside them and placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said, his voice full of remorse. "I should have listened to you from the beginning. I should have protected Emily." Sophie looked at her father, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "You can fix this now, Dad. You can do the right thing." James nodded and stood up, turning to face the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I would like to change my position in this case. I believe my wife, Victoria Reed, has tampered with evidence and wrongfully incriminated Emily Parker. I ask that the court consider the new evidence and reevaluate the case." Victoria, who was sitting further away, erupted in anger. "James, how could you do this to me? I'm your wife. I was only trying to protect our family." James looked at her with an expression of disgust. "No, Victoria, you were trying to protect yourself, and in the process, you destroyed the trust I had in you. I will no longer be an accomplice to your lies." The courtroom fell silent as the judge watched the scene intently. He paused before saying, "Mr. Wilson, your change in position will be noted." We will proceed with the evaluation of the evidence and hear the closing arguments before a decision is made. As James returned to his seat, he cast one last look at Emily. I promise you, Emily, that I will do everything I can to make this right, and I will work every day to regain your trust. Emily simply nodded, still processing everything that had happened. But for the first time in weeks, she felt that justice was finally within reach. The courtroom was silent, save for the muffled murmurs of people trying to process everything that had transpired. Victoria Reed was sitting motionless, as if the weight of the evidence and statements had finally shattered her confidence. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for an exit, a solution, but all she found were looks of disapproval. She knew she was cornered. When the judge announced a recess to evaluate the new evidence, Victoria abruptly stood up. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "I need to step out for a moment." The judge gave her a distrustful look but nodded. "Don't be long, Mrs. Reed. We will need your presence for the remainder of the proceedings." Victoria walked briskly towards the door, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. As she exited the room, she quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the courthouse exit. Her mind was racing, desperately seeking a way to escape the situation. She knew that once the trial resumed, there would be no more denying the facts. Outside, she spotted a side door leading to a side corridor and followed it, trying to avoid prying eyes. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her breathing was rapid. "I can't let this end like this," she muttered to herself, as if repeating those words would be enough to reverse reality. However, she failed to notice that her movements were being monitored. Margaret, who had been watching Victoria leave the room in haste, sensed that something was amiss. Wasting no time, she stood up and whispered to Sophie, "Stay here, dear. I'll be right back." Margaret followed Victoria discreetly, watching her enter the side corridor. When she realized Victoria was trying to exit through the back door, she called one of the courthouse security guards. "Please come quickly, Mrs. Reed is trying to flee." Victoria reached the door and pushed it open forcefully, stepping out into the parking lot. The cold outside air sent a chill down her skin, but she kept running, trying to reach her car. That's when she heard rapid footsteps behind her. "Victoria Reed!" shouted one of the guards, approaching her. "Stop immediately!" Victoria looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide. "I didn't do anything wrong!" she yelled, but her words sounded hollow, as if she no longer believed them herself. She tried to run but tripped over her own steps, falling to her knees on the asphalt. The guard reached her and grabbed her arm firmly. "Ma'am, you're under arrest. Please return to the courtroom at once." Victoria tried to resist, but it was futile. Margaret appeared shortly after, watching the scene with a steady gaze. "You can run, Victoria, but the truth will always catch up with you," Margaret said, her words carrying a calm that Victoria could no longer ignore. Defeated, Victoria was escorted back into the courtroom, where she would face what she feared most, the truth and the consequences of her actions. The courtroom was in complete silence when the judge returned to his place, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the last pages of the documents presented. All eyes were fixed on him, but none were more anxious than Emily's, Sophie's, and Margaret's. Victoria, now seated with her hands handcuffed after her attempted escape, looked down, unable to face the room. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak in a firm but controlled voice. After carefully reviewing the new evidence presented, including the video recordings, financial documents, and blackmail letters, this court concludes that the evidence against Emily Parker was deliberately fabricated. Furthermore, it is clear that the accusation was the result of intentional manipulation by Victoria Reed. He paused, looking directly at Emily, who was seated in the defendant's bench. "Emily Parker, this court overturns your conviction and declares that all charges against you are nullified with immediate effect." Emily brought her hands to her mouth, her tears flowing uncontrollably. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. Sophie jumped up from her seat and ran to Emily, enveloping her in a tight embrace. "I knew this would happen, Emily. I knew they would believe you." The judge continued, now looking at Victoria. "As for Mrs. Reed, evidence of her actions will be forwarded for further investigation. You will be held in custody while we await new legal proceedings." As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Emily felt the weight she had been carrying finally lifted from her shoulders. She looked at Margaret and Sophie, knowing that without them, this moment would never have been possible. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe peacefully. The courtroom had emptied, but Emily remained there, still trying to process what had happened. When Sophie ran back toward her, the two met in a tight embrace that seemed to last an eternity. Emily held the girl as if she never wanted to let go, while Sophie sobbed on her shoulder. "You're free, Emily," Sophie said through her tears. "I knew you hadn't done anything wrong. I knew we would be able to prove it." Emily smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was for you, Sophie. Everything I did was for you. And now, thanks to you and your grandmother, I have my life back." Margaret approached next with a warm smile and eyes shining with pride. "Emily, you are part of this family. We couldn't have done anything less than fight for you." Before they could say more, Victoria, handcuffed and escorted by two officers, walked past the group. She paused briefly, her face displaying a mixture of defeat and remorse. "I did it," Victoria admitted, her voice faltering. "I manipulated everything. I stole the money. I blamed you, Emily, because I was desperate. I didn't want my past to destroy everything." Margaret gave her a stern look, but said nothing. Sophie, with her childlike innocence, asked, "Why did you do it, Victoria? Why did you hurt us?" Victoria lowered her head, unable to answer. The officers led her away, leaving only the echo of her words down the hallway. Emily looked at Sophie and Margaret, embracing them again. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could start over. They had won together, and nothing could break the bond they shared. James Wilson walked slowly up to Emily, his hands in his pockets and his gaze full of remorse. He looked smaller, as if the weight of his wrong decisions had shrunk him before the woman he had wrongly accused. Margaret and Sophie stepped back a little, allowing the two of them to have a moment alone. "Emily," James began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I don't even know how to begin to apologize. I failed you in every possible way. I chose to trust lies when I should have believed in your integrity." Emily looked at him for a moment, her face still marked by the weariness of weeks of injustice, but there was something in her eyes. Compassion. "Mr. Wilson, I never expected perfection from you. I just wanted to be treated fairly. I did my best for Sophie and for this family, because you all mean so much to me." James took a deep breath, his eyes watery. "And you were more than fair. You were the person who kept this family together, when I didn't know how to do it. Emily, I know you have every right to walk away and never look back, but if there's any chance, please stay. I promise I will never doubt you again." Emily felt a lump in her throat, touched by his words. She lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to control the emotion that overflowed in her chest. "I'm not here for money or obligation, Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm here for Sophie, because she is like a daughter to me. Every smile of hers, every accomplishment, every moment by her side means everything to me, and as long as she needs me, I will be here, always." James nodded, touched by her response. He extended his hand, hesitant, as if asking permission to mend what had been broken. Emily stepped forward and embraced him sincerely, surprising him. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I will earn your trust again, for you and for Sophie. I promise I will never fail you again." As the two remained embraced, Emily felt that those words carried something more, a belated but genuine acknowledgement of her place in the family. She knew that despite the difficulties, there was room for a fresh start, and that was enough to keep her there. A few weeks later, the court reconvened to try Victoria Reed, now as the defendant. The room was full, but this time there was none of the charm or confidence that Victoria once displayed. Seated in the defendant's chair, she looked smaller, with hunched shoulders and eyes fixed on the ground as if she already knew what the verdict would be. The judge calmly read the sentence. "After considering all the evidence and testimonies presented, this court finds Victoria Reed guilty of theft, tampering with evidence, and perjury. The defendant will be sentenced to 5 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first year." The sound of the gavel echoed in the room, and murmurs of approval arose among those present. From the back of the room, Sophie held Emily's hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and justice. Margaret stood beside them, with a discreet but deeply satisfied smile. They knew that, although nothing could erase the damage caused by Victoria, the truth had finally prevailed. As they left the courthouse, Sophie looked up at Emily with a radiant smile. "Now you can come home, Emily. Nothing will separate us again. Emily crouched down to Sophie's level, holding her hands. I never really left, Sophie. My heart was always with you. In the days that followed, Emily returned to the Wilson mansion. The house, which had once felt like a place filled with secrets and tensions, now seemed lit by a fresh start. Emily resumed her place in the family's routine, but this time with the renewed trust of everyone. James, Sophie, and Margaret made sure to show her every day how valued she was. Emily knew that her place there was more than a job. It was a home. The Wilson house seemed different now. Not just brighter, but filled with a sense of unity that had once seemed impossible. Sophie ran through the garden, laughing as Emily helped her set up a small swing under a tree. The sound of the girls' laughter echoed through the property, and even James, who watched from a lounge chair, seemed more relaxed, as if the weight of the past few months had finally been lifted. Inside the house, Margaret was in the kitchen, mixing ingredients for dinner. She had moved into the mansion, something that had once seemed unlikely, but now felt natural. With Victoria out of the picture, Margaret had become the family's pillar, helping to rebuild the bonds that had been broken. "Emily, come here for a moment," Margaret called from the kitchen. Emily came in, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it, Margaret?" Margaret smiled, a smile full of tenderness. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for Sophie and this family. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." Emily returned the smile, feeling a deep gratitude for finally being recognized as part of that house. "I only did what anyone would do for those they loved, Margaret. This family is mine too." As the two talked, Sophie came running through the door, holding a flower she had picked from the garden. "Look, Grandma, I brought it for you," she said, handing the flower to Margaret with a radiant smile. Margaret took the flower, touched. "Thank you, dear. This house is finally the way it should have always been, full of love." As the sun set, the family gathered around the table, savoring not only the dinner, but also the comfort of being together again. The morning was clear, with the sun gently entering through the mansion's windows. Emily was in the living room, arranging books on the shelf, while Sophie drew at a nearby table. The atmosphere was peaceful, but charged with a sense of renewal, as if everyone there was ready for a fresh start. "Emily," called Sophie with a sweet and lively voice, "look what I drew." She held up a paper with a colorful drawing of two people holding hands under a large tree. One was clearly Sophie, with her long hair, and the other was Emily, with a radiant face. Emily approached, carefully taking the drawing. Her eyes filled with tears as she examined the details. "Sophie, it's beautiful. Did you make this for me?" Sophie smiled and nodded. "Yes, because you're my family. No matter what happens, I'll always want you here with me." Emily knelt beside the girl and enveloped her in a tight hug. "You don't know what this means to me, Sophie. I'll always be here for you no matter what happens." James entered the room at that moment, pausing for an instant near the door to observe the scene before him. Sunlight streamed through the wide living room windows, bathing the space in golden hues. Sophie was seated beside Emily, her eyes shining as she explained the meaning of the drawing she had just completed. There was a calm, reassuring energy in the air, something James hadn't felt in his home for a long time. He smiled, feeling a deep gratitude for having Emily back, but also a twinge of guilt for what she had endured. James cleared his throat softly, drawing their attention. "Am I interrupting something important?" he asked, a slight smile on his face. Sophie looked up at her father, holding the drawing enthusiastically. "Look, Dad, I drew Emily and me together, because she's part of our family." James approached and took the drawing from Sophie's hands, studying it for a moment. He knelt beside the two, looking directly at Emily. "It's a beautiful drawing, Sophie, and she's right, Emily. You've always been part of this family, even when I was foolish enough not to see it." Before Emily could respond, Margaret entered the room, balancing a silver tray with cups of tea and a bowl of homemade cookies. "I hope no one here is sneaking sweets," she said playfully, setting the tray on the coffee table. She looked at James and Emily, sensing the moment between them, and decided to let the conversation flow naturally. They all gathered on the sofa, and as Margaret poured the tea, Sophie tugged on Emily's hand. "Emily, will you help me with another drawing later? I want to make one for Grandma, too." Emily laughed, squeezing Sophie's hand. "Of course, dear. We'll make as many drawings as you like." As Sophie's laughter filled the room, James looked around. The mansion felt different, as if new life had been breathed into it. For the first time in a long while, he realized this place wasn't just a house. Finally, it was a home. Did you like the story of Emily and Sophie? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.